Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, opinion writer and columnist, and I'm joined by
Nancy Pryor-Johnson, Deputy Editorial Board Editor.
Metro Editor Greg Jefferson.
It's our first podcast episode of 2024. Happy New Year to everybody, and thanks for listening and watching. We're going to talk today about an upcoming council resolution vote on regarding the conflict between Israel and Hamas. We're going to talk about SB 4, Texas law that was signed by Governor Greg Abbott a couple of weeks ago. But we're going to start off talking about some news that happened in San Antonio over the weekend. District 10 Councilman Marc Whyte was arrested on Friday night on it was a DUI charge, and he was apparently driving northeast on 410 near the San Antonio airport. He was kind of weaving between lanes, not signaling. When he was stopped by police officers, they just described his eyes as glassy and red. He refused to take a breathalyzer and a blood test, but then later they got a magistrate judge to require that. So I think we're waiting on the results. Right?
So this, I think they got the blood draw at around 2 a.m.
Yeah. I think one of the obvious things that people thought about is the fact that Marc Whyte is a first-term council member. He's been in office for about 8 months now. And the person he succeeded, Clayton Perry, about a year ago, had a very, it was an extreme DUI situation where he slammed into a car. He left the scene. There was a video of a police officer at his home talking to him, and he just seemed to be really out of it. And you had some former council members from that district, this Northside district, urging Clayton Perry to step aside, and they were supporting Marc Whyte, and Marc Whyte has come in and he's had this happen to him. So
yeah, I mean, with Clayton Perry, we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about Marc Whyte's arrest. We don't know about the circumstance. All of that, I think, will be clearer in the days ahead,
right?
Particularly when we get the police body cam video and the results of the blood alcohol content test, which, he took in the early hours of Saturday. But I mean, just from what we know, it's not as egregious as what we saw in Clayton Perry's case. I mean, as that was a career-ending thing. I mean, he was clearly hammered. He, had about 14 drinks at the Evil Olive on the north side, slammed into a car that was idling at an intersection, and then drove home.
The wrong way.
Yeah, exactly. And, the body cam video of the police officer's interview with Perry was just, it was humiliating for Perry. It was sad to watch. And there was just, clearly, there was just no getting over that. We don't have any reason to think at this point that there's anything like that in Marc Whyte's case. But, this is, he's a city council member in a city that has a huge drunk driving problem. And this is, this is
it's the last thing the city council.
It's like egregious in itself.
Yeah.
It may not have like all of the kind of nasty details that Clayton Perry's case did, but it's still pretty bad.
And to that point, we had, I think 2021, we had nearly 2,000 drunk driver caused crashes in San Antonio. So it has been a problem that the city has been trying to deal with. I think he said that he had 3 beers, apparently at 3 different locations.
And that he didn't feel drunk. That was the first sentence of his statement. I didn't.
Somebody asked on social media, I think it was X, and they said, "Does Uber not run up there? Like, does it not go to that part of the city?"
Yeah.
And actually, that's Uber does. Uber does go to that part of the city.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's just. They just take too many chances, I feel like. I feel like there should be a no tolerance, like no zero Like, the city shouldn't tolerate it, but also they should just not even try like one drink. I mean, I think I have to say, like, all these headlines, I'm scared. I will not. Like, I'm just like, nope, I'm not going to drive. And it's just like, why chance it? That you're going to be that person. And I mean, it's not only getting caught, it's killing somebody. Like,
absolutely.
Our editorial for the weekend was, and we focused on DWI. We had already written the editorial. So it was already done. And then we see this news headline. It's like, what is happening here? Again. So yeah, maybe it's not as bad as Perry, like, but it's still
like happened. I said, we don't know. And it's like, excuse me, I'll be a little skeptical about the 3 beers. Yeah. To me, what's important will be the blood alcohol test, the results of that.
Right.
That's of much more interest to me than what Marc Whyte has to say about his own drinking.
Something else we had over the weekend was an op-ed by a local attorney, and he wrote about DWIs. And I was pleasantly surprised that I expected a DWI attorney to write and say, okay, if you get stopped, this is what you do. Mm-hmm. Don't take the breathalyzer. Don't do all these things. No, he wrote about the incidence of it. And he said, for the cost of one DWI, you can actually buy hundreds of Uber rides. In fact, he did the math, 566, because it's over $17,000. And you can have an Uber ride. I mean, a guesstimate there. But I thought that was a really interesting way to look at it. I mean, like if you look at big cities, like let's say New York, right? Everybody gets on the subway. And so if you drink, you go out, you can get on the subway. You don't have to worry about it. So here we don't have that, obviously, right? You can't just hop on the train after you've had a night out, a celebration, even if you think it's 1 or 2 or whatever you do on your time. But you do have Uber. And if you have to just kind of count that in. And so what this attorney said in his DWI, again, yes, he makes money. That is how he makes his career, right? Is on DWIs. But he's not saying this is what you do and call me and stuff like that. Why? Because he knows he's going to get the business in San Antonio.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, because we've seen, I think really it was like the 1980s, as I remember, when we started to see a real movement on this issue, and you had Mothers Against Drunk Driving and stuff.
Yeah.
And you had laws becoming stiffer. Yeah. Penalties becoming stiffer on this. But there's always that component, which is that people are going to be in denial. And I'm not saying that this is the case with Marc Whyte. I mean, as Greg said, we have to wait to see what the evidence tells us. But I think it's a common thing that people are in denial about it. And if you are drunk, you're less likely to take the responsible attitude and say, I can't do
Nobody
this.
Feels drunk, or like, I guess you do. But the issue is like what the attorney said, which is really interesting, is he said, this is the crime that nobody intends. Like you don't ever say, I'm going to go get a DWI today. And I could say, you know what? I think that could be true. Who says today's going to be the day I'm going to get a DWI? It's just like you have a drink or two, and one may lead to another or whatever. Yeah. And I also think sometimes it mixes with your medications, and sometimes it affects you in different ways, like, your body.
I mean, this may be old fashioned, but I would argue that any city council member has a higher standard.
Oh, absolutely.
They should.
And this was just a gross failing, Yeah. And I mean, I don't think anything he said should detract from that.
I think they shouldn't drink at all. Not even one, not even chancing, not even one drink, and then drive.
As far as like elected officials, local elected, I was thinking about Kevin Wolf years ago when he was on the commissioner's court. He had an incident where he said that his alcohol and medication mixed, and he went into was it a Whataburger?
Whataburger
parking lot, and he
was he in the drive-through lane?
He was in the drive-through lane, and he was smashing into cars. I mean, nobody was hurt. It was a very embarrassing situation. I think his initial response was kind of a little glib, but then I think within a few days he had a press conference, took responsibility for it.
Yeah, and to me, I was at that news conference, and that's the way to handle it. Mm-hmm. I mean, he had a prepared statement, obviously, but then he opened it up to questions from the press, and the entire news conference lasted a good hour. And
it was right away, right? It wasn't. It
was
take,
within a few days.
That's right.
Like 3 or 4 days.
That's right.
I mean, I think, and that's not surprising. I mean, his first response, as you say, was kind of glib. I think it was an interview with an Express News reporter
when he was coming out.
He was coming. He had just been released from jail. He'd made bail.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah.
And then, I'm sure he checked in, and I'm certain this is what Marc Whyte's doing now, checking.
Yeah.
He's probably in constant touch with, political leaders, neighborhood leaders in District 10 to find out kind of where he stands, where that's going.
As you said, I mean, he said, I didn't feel drunk. I mean, there were elements of his statement that were, in which he maybe didn't take full responsibility, but ultimately he did say he apologized and that if he did have to drink at all, meant that he shouldn't have. Yeah. So I think he certainly handled it better. It's not only that the circumstances are less extreme than Clayton Perry's, but I think up to this point, he hasn't said a lot, but he's handled it better. The question is what the city council will do. In the case of Clayton Perry, they were almost obligated to take some kind of action. Ron Nirenberg, the mayor, stripped him of his committee assignments, and he was also censured by the council. I mean, I'm kind of wondering if we're going to see that kind of thing happen.
Yeah, I don't know. And right now, we don't know. I mean, we've our City Hall reporter is trying to pin that down as we speak, whether there's going to be a censure vote or whether, Marc Whyte will be removed from his city council committees like Clayton Perry was.
Could they do some kind of policy on, like, say, no drinking? Like, no drinking. No. They can't say that. No. It's too much. Like, I would just say if I see any city council member or a not only city council, but a school board member, a member of the media, a member of the media. We've had a lot of headlines.
Yeah, I mean, I don't drink, but I would be
it's too much.
Deeply offended if somebody said to me,
drink and drive.
As a condition of what you do for a living, you can't.
You're talking about
drinking.
I don't know. Like if you're somewhere and you see
and you've had anything, you've had any alcohol,
and you're watching them take a drink. I'm just watching them like, oh my gosh, you're going to be the next headline.
Yeah.
Like you don't want
hard to enforce
for anybody.
But
if you think about it, like, their constituents, they voted them in and they have a job to do. Yeah. So now their constituents are going to go without just because he went and had some drinks. It's just silly.
But I think this case is not only because we don't know as much, but I think the circumstances pose more of a gray area than the Clayton Perry case, and I think it'll be for the council. I think it's going to be a little trickier.
But you didn't deny it, though.
And I don't want to say, I don't want to get too much into Clayton Perry's history, but I mean, those of us who follow City Council will know that had been talk, at City Hall for quite a while. That he would talk to people about going out and drinking quite a bit. This is not part of the reputation that Marc Whyte has, unless. Oh,
I mean, he doesn't have much of a reputation. He's 6 months into office.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have much of a reputation at all.
Right.
His council, his council colleagues are still learning about the guy.
Right.
But I mean, like the Megan Rodriguez in her reporting over the weekend, she talked to several council members, and their reaction was very muted.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you go back to the immediate aftermath of Clayton Perry and, the night of his accident, the accident he caused, it too was kind of, except for Nirenberg, right? Mayor Nirenberg, he came out very strong, but other council colleagues were kind of a little quiet.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably embarrassed, and they were embarrassed back when the whole Anna Sandoval thing happened, and they just keep having these city council people who just keep embarrassing them, and they need this is not why you want to be part of a story. You just don't.
Mm-hmm. Wanted to move to another city council issue, which is that it looks like we're going to have a council vote soon. We have a memo from 3 council members, an unusual coalition in the sense we had the two most progressive members of the city council, Terry Castillo on the west side, Jalen McKee Rodriguez on the east side, joining forces with Manny Pelaez, who I think they've butted heads with him probably somewhat. I think it's fair to say over various issues. And they've joined forces with them on this resolution, which calls for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the conflict that's happening there, and also for an immediate return of all hostages that have been taken. So, and I think the idea is to have a special council meeting on January 11th to vote on this. What should we know about this? I mean, again, I think it was interesting that these three came together.
Yeah. And, Manny Pelaez told one of our reporters, it's like what he expects is a one-sentence resolution along the lines of nobody should die. I mean, basically, it's very general.
And he's been very supportive of I think he's been pretty supportive of Israel, or certainly with the relationship between San Antonio and the city of Tel Aviv. And Jalen McKee Rodriguez and Terry Castillo, I think, have been much more supportive of the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, and that's why I don't see a one sentence resolution happening. I think there's likely to be a big fight over it. And the Manny Pelaez, we know he's likely a mayoral candidate in 2025. I just wonder if that feeds into this at all. I mean, this is going to be a platform for him to talk about his support for the state of Israel, but also to take what I assume will be kind of a more reasoned approach and say, look, I mean, what they're doing is unconscionable. They should do less of it, something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think he's setting up, he'll be engaging in a pretty ideological fight with, really the most progressive wing, the most left wing of the city council, which would be Jalen McKee Rodriguez and Terry Castillo.
Yeah. I just edited a letter to the editor from someone, and it'll be in the paper tomorrow, who said basically, San Antonio has nothing to do with this and should stay out of it. Basically, that's the gist of it. And we've had several letters kind of like that, and just like this is not a San Antonio thing. They just need to stay silent on it. But in this case, I don't think so. I think that they need to have that fight. I think that they need to come to a consensus and say something and do something, resolve. Because I had this conversation with Manny a little while back, and he talked about the division that's happening in our city. And he talked about all these during public comments before, I don't know, there's some part of the city council meeting where they don't record it and you can't go back and watch it. So I didn't see it, but he just said it gets really hot. And he said that they are just really, and he says it's on the Palestinian side, and then they go and it's just hate-filled, really, really extreme talk, and actually some of the city council members aren't, sometimes they just question if they're even safe. I just think like the level, we don't realize just how outspoken like both sides are, but especially that side. And I think that they need to be careful, and I think they will. And we should wait and see how it folds out there.
It's always interesting when you have city councils getting involved in what are basically making symbolic statements on issues that don't really affect the city. And I think about SB 1070, Arizona, the so-called Show Me Your Papers law, which is, I think, passed in 2010. And Julian Castro was mayor at the time, and he pushed for a resolution in opposition to that. And it was very contentious. I mean, that council meeting went on for hours, and there was so much division about it. I mean, I guess you could make the argument in that case that it was a statement to anyone wanting to do business in San Antonio. We don't agree with that. But you could, if the city had just not said anything, I mean, I don't think anybody would have come to the conclusion that city leadership supported SB 1070. Right. So, and I mean, you've had during the Iraq War, you had some city councils coming out with resolutions in opposition. It's always an interesting thing. I think one of the things that really strikes me about this is that when the news was broken about this memo and this proposed resolution, you had the organization San Antonio for Justice in Palestine came out strongly in support of it. They said, quote, "This was a big moment for our city," and they said we must mobilize big and win this vote. And people who follow politics in the city will know that 2 months ago, representatives from the same organization went to a Democratic event where Congressman Joaquin Castro was speaking, disrupted his speech. They talked to him afterwards, and they got into an argument with him. And they were unhappy because he would not support a resolution backed by some progressive members of the U.S. House calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And what he said was that he had come out publicly in favor of a ceasefire, but also wanted to see the release of all hostages, meaning Israeli hostages held by Hamas. The language that we're seeing here so far, based on this memo, is calling for an immediate ceasefire and the immediate release of all hostages. And so what is somewhat confusing to me is if it was, because there were people, and there have continued to be people who thought Joaquin Castro, he's on the wrong side of this. He's pro-Israel on this, or he's insensitive to the suffering of the Palestinian civilians who have been bombed by Israel. Right. In retaliation to the Hamas attack of October 7th. And so he's gotten all that criticism. And he's basically said, I support a ceasefire. He didn't support that particular resolution because he didn't mention anything about hostages. This thing also has something about hostages, which is, it seems to be perfectly in line with what he's saying. And this organization, San Antonio for Justice in Palestine, which were very upset with him, they're very supportive of this. I'm not looking to you for answers on this. I'm just saying, like, that's. Thank you.
I got no answers for it.
Yeah, I just thought that was interesting, and it just shows how there's these are very emotional issues, understandably, and groups tend to take the sort of
right.
They kind of fragment into these groups, and sometimes it's not all about logic when it comes to these things.
Right. Yeah. And like, it's not exactly a totally rational thing to say that a resolution of the city council of San Antonio is going to matter, because it's not. It's the politics of gesture. The question is, like, is there really a rift so big in the city that the city council does need to step in?
According to Manny, it's a vocal, small,
Yeah, but he's
not in numbers.
Yeah, Manny's talking. First of all, that's we're hearing that from Manny. Yeah, and it's a Wednesday night
he said it's
event.
Hours long, and it keeps happening.
Yeah, but I mean, if you have, and that's the thing, if you have organized groups that are getting people out.
Yeah,
look, their views are valid.
Right.
Like, they care enough to show up. They should be heard.
Absolutely.
But
this will show that they're being heard.
Right. But does that reflect the city more broadly? Like, is it really a question?
Is the city really being torn apart, or is it really?
Are we watching what happens at Citizens to be Heard on Wednesday night?
Yeah.
Like, is that what this comes down to, or is there this great kind of yawning rift in the city over this issue?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I also wonder if there is that kind of rift, would this solve it? But I don't know that it's good, because there's going to be disagreement about this too.
That's a good question. Will it be enough?
I think that what's in the resolution is perfectly reasonable, but I just think it's interesting that how this language is not being received in exactly the same way that that Joaquin Castro's very similar stance was being seen, and I think there's a lot of politics involved in this. But we're going to move on from that, and want to talk about the latest developments with SB 4, which is a new state law. It's going into effect in March, and it was signed into law 2 weeks ago by Governor Greg Abbott on the border in Brownsville. And this has been compared to that Arizona law that from 2010 I mentioned. This will empower local and state law enforcement to arrest people who are in the country illegally. This has really been a federal issue. The Supreme Court has ruled, and in response to that Arizona law, they ruled that this is a federal issue, not a state or local issue. Also, in practical terms, when you're asking law enforcement to do this, they're going to be asked or expected to stop people who they suspect might be here illegally, which gets into the show me your papers type
just
of
with that,
issue.
Right? No other crime, no other suspected crime.
That's right.
That's it. Just if you appear to be.
Yeah, that's right.
Who's illegal?
And you've got law enforcement in counties close to the border already expressing concerns that this is going to take manpower away.
Yeah.
It's their jails are overcrowded, and then you've had representatives in Mexico saying they're upset about this because as this law works, you'd have someone imprisoned for a few months and then sent back to Mexico. And as we've talked about in this podcast, many of the people who have tried to come across the border in recent years are not from Mexico. They're from from other countries. Yes. And Mexico, I think it's an inhumane approach on top of everything else. But the idea of we're just going to send you into Mexico when that's not the country of origin for many of these people. So when you look at this, I mean, what are some of the problems the potential problems that you see?
Well, the constitutionality of it. I mean,
a little thing like that.
Yeah. Although, it's like, look, you're right. The Supreme Court, in the case of Arizona, they said no.
Yeah.
Control of the borders is a federal thing. This is what the federal government does. But I mean, that was a fairly fractured court. This was not a unanimous vote. And
it's a more conservative court now.
Exactly. It's a much more conservative court now. And it could have, I think everybody agrees that this is headed to the Supreme Court. I mean, you've got the El Paso County has already filed suit in Austin to stop the SB4. The Justice Department is now threatening a lawsuit. They're basically saying they gave Governor Abbott until Wednesday to, I guess not say, oh, I have changed my mind about that law. I don't see that happening. It's going to the court, and it is I mean, and it could be. I mean, like, who would be surprised if this Supreme Court said, you know what Texas is doing, taking control of immigration policy into its own hands, is totally legitimate, and it's right by law.
I mean, it's inhumane. It really is. I mean, I just helped somebody on my way in here, actually, into this building. I was walking in here, and this man stopped me, and he had one very small backpack, and he only spoke Spanish, and he was asking for walking directions to the bus company. He had just been to a bus company that was too expensive. He was looking for a less expensive bus company. And I was trying to help him and running late to get here. Sorry. But I mean, theoretically, a police officer would be able to arrest him. I mean, or maybe arrest him and say, show me your papers. This man
potentially
who is, I felt so bad for him. I may not even have made it here. I wanted to put him in my car and take him myself, drive him over there myself. And it's cold outside. He's going to walk. And that other place he was looking for was far. I told him it's far. It's not, it's not close to here. But an officer could, Governor Abbott wants an officer just to say, okay, show me your papers and arrest him.
Yeah.
That's terrible. And he was very kind and very patient and my Spanish isn't the best, very kind and patient and trying to get help. But obviously he had no phone. He didn't have enough money and you're going to arrest him for that.
And this has been part of something that we've seen from Greg Abbott and really even Rick Perry before him, the idea that, the federal government isn't doing their job, so we're going to take control of this issue. And this is part of, and I think Republicans who supported this bill will deny it. But I think if you really look at it, I think Greg Abbott had to know that there would be legal challenges, and it really feels to me
he anticipated,
and I think this is something he wants.
Yes.
He wants this to go to the Supreme Court. He wants the foundation of how we approach immigration, which is that it's a federal issue, to be overturned and to open this up. And if you look at, he was asked a question at the signing ceremony in Brownsville about the constitutionality of this, and he said, "We think that Texas has constitutional authority to do this, but we also welcome." We welcome a Supreme Court decision that would overturn the precedent set in the Arizona case.
Of course, because I mean, he wins either way.
Yeah,
in different ways.
That's right.
So he either gets what he wants, which is for the state of Texas to to effectively take control of its border with Mexico, or even in defeat, he can go to his base and say, I gave it my very best.
Yeah, that's right.
And in the meantime,
this liberal Supreme Court. Totally,
that's right. Gorsuch and Kavanaugh.
Immigration attorneys and social workers are trying to prepare. I mean, how well can you prepare people? But they're trying to prepare them. I saw something last week that said, make sure you have your papers ready to show at all times. Make sure you have a network of people. And if you're not legal, right? If you don't have your documentation, make sure, and even if you do, make sure that like if your kids are at school or they're not with you, make sure, or if they're with you, like make sure you have somebody to help with your kids, because what's going to happen to the kids? Yeah. And those are huge questions. And it's terrible.
We've got undeniable challenges at the border, and we have need for serious immigration reform. But this is not
You see,
this is not the answer.
Sending the buses to New Jersey now. So,
and you were in New York, and you experienced this recently. Yeah.
Yes. And in New York, and so now Mayor Eric Adams in New York said, okay, we're going to fine every bus $2,000, which really $2,000 is not a lot compared. Abbott's willing to spend everything, right?
Yeah.
Millions, billions on this. And so now, over the weekend, they're rerouting it to New Jersey now. So that's where they're going now.
Well, it's something we're going to be following. And again, we hope everyone had a good New Year. The holidays were good for you. And we're going to be back again next week. Take care.